Audiocast test, Chambers.
Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody for coming out to Transportation Committee this afternoon. We're getting a bit of a late start because a number of us were at the funeral for Mr. Woodard, the bus operator, and on behalf of members of the Transportation Committee, I want to express our deepest condolences to not only the Woodard family, but to all of those impacted by this terrible tragedy. Our thoughts and our prayers are with the family and friends of all of those who have lost a loved one or been injured as a result of the September 18th collision. We will start with the agenda, running through it to see if there's anything that we can move forward with on a consent basis. And I understand that Councillor Clark may have to leave a little bit early, so we'll try and get this. Not today? Okay.
They're a week out of slack.
Perfect. Perfect. Because we wouldn't want to have it without Councillor Clark. No declarations of interest received. Confirmation of the minutes of the 4th of September 2013. Thank you. We have a number of responses to inquiries on the communications, and I understand that Councillor Moffat would like to speak to one of those.
I just want to move that the infilling of ditches be added to the agenda in November, so I can speak to it at that point.
Okay, thank you very much. And what's that, Councillor Clark?
For whatever reasons, I have not seen the TRC 713 response. Pardon?
Yeah, if you can.
I'd say, Mr. Chair, can we get that on an agenda too going forward? Doesn't have to be November, it can be after we're done with the TMP, but the inquiry does not answer the questions that we were looking for, so we need to make it an item and get staff to provide more detail.
We can certainly do that. I can also ask staff to speak to you offline to see if they can deal with the questions in advance, and we'll do that as well.
Great, thank you.
The traffic signal, that's TRC 05, has been remedied by having a police officer there 24/7, and the condensation in the one through lane and turn lane, so that people can just operate their vehicles. It's not perfect, and hopefully it's not long. Right?
Great.
Okay, thank you very much, councillors. We're now run through the agenda, and first thing on the agenda is the Chinatown Local Area Parking Study, which we will hold at this point because I believe we have a delegation. And I believe that is the delegation in support? Is council or is committee rather prepared to pass this? Carried. Okay. So we don't need to hear from you, but thank you so much for coming down. Number 2 is the report on wild parsnips, and that's simply for receipt.
Hold.
Hold.
Yes.
Number 3 is a speed reduction request on Sherwood Drive from Councillor Hobbs. Okay, I believe we have delegations here, so if it's carried, again, thank you for coming down. Everybody was in support, I believe? Okay, carried. Next is item number 4, proposed road allowance landscaping in the Bradley Estates community. Hold. Carried. Okay. As much as we'd like to do that, So we'll go back to the one held item then, which is the wild parsnip report, which Councillor Moffat held. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I imagine my colleagues are really ensconced in the wild parsnip file, as I am. Mr. O'Keefe, thank you for being here, and thank you for providing this response to my inquiry from July. Just a couple things on it. One of my questions was about costing. Well, I guess it wasn't necessarily, but it was talking about had we explored the direction of using pesticides in some of the areas where wild parsnip is a large concern. Your response doesn't highlight any costing of really anything. So I'm curious. I know that we made cuts to roadside ditching in terms of the rural cuts. I think we only do it 1.5 times, whereas we used to do it 3 times. I'm wondering, and you might not be able to do it today, but if you can come back to me at some points, what is the cost of adding an additional cut? You know, what would be the cost of the pesticides? I know that Brian Denyes had spoke to me, who was the acting area roads manager in the west zone at the time, had spoken to me that he was looking into the cost of pesticides to be applied to treat wild parsnip. There isn't a mention of cost in the response, and I'm wondering if you could also respond to that.
Yes, we can take that away, and we will come back with some costs. We do have costs for pesticides. There's a standing offer out there to have but generally usually for poison ivy in populated areas around pedestrian pathways. And we have some pricing we can work with, and we'll look at some kilometer cost maybe and come back with some information for you that way. The cost of the extra cutting will be easy to determine based on our normal practices for cuts. We have good activity date information on that.
Right. So, and also, I noticed that the response sort of just says that you'll keep doing what you've been doing, which is cutting it, because it's a method of control. However, a lot of the cuts in the rural area took place in mid-July, which, as you know, is when wild parsnip goes to seed. The ideal time to cut would have been mid-June. You know, from roadside all the way to fence line would have been the most ideal time to cut, because then you would have caught it before it you know, proliferates and causes harm to anyone that goes near it. You know, how come we didn't cut when we should have?
Well, we cut on our normal practice. Usually we go out in the first cut of the year is one pass along the shoulder of the rural roads, and then we come back after the growth cycle's over and cut. If we went too early, it would grow back up most of the weeds, ragweed, things like that. So we have historically tried to time our second cut to go when the grass or the vegetation has matured. In the case of wild parsnip, it's too late. You're correct, and we may have to alter how we do locations like that. Maybe specific cuts around wild parsnip, because it does go to seed in July, and then it's only dangerous when it's still before it matures, when the sap is still in the stem there.
That's right, which is mid-June to mid-July.
That's correct.
Like I've been trying to educate the residents on it as much as I can, but and I think the city's attempting to go in that direction as well, which is something good to do. But at the same time, if there's areas where it's closest to residents, where they can be affected most. I mean, if it's on Roger Stevens in the middle of Marlborough Forest, okay, you know, maybe a cut once a year isn't the end of the world, but when you've got it in the middle of Kings Grant Park, right next to a play structure, you know, maybe the attractiveness of a yellow flower for a 5-year-old isn't exactly the best thing. So that's where I just think there has to be a way that, sure, we don't go after every single plant in the city, but there has to be a better way to manage it than what we've been doing. And if you can get me the cost of, you know, what would it be? So if we run through the budget in the Agricultural Affairs Committee next month, you know, what would it cost to, you know, increase our cuts in the rural area? And then again, what is the cost for pesticides? You know, if it's a localized pesticide treatment application, where it's at its worst.
I will commit to do that and have it I'll get it to you as soon as possible to review.
Thank you.
So is that satisfactory, Councillor Moffat?
So far, so good.
So far, so good. Excellent. Councillor Wilkinson, you would like to speak to the same matter?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The problem I had with this one, Larry, is that this is very much based on a rural issue. It's also an urban issue. It's in the parks, and it's particularly in the hydro easement that goes through one of my communities. And when we sent in about that one, because there was huge amounts of wild parsnip in there, the staff response was we would cut 3 feet on each side of the pathway, but the kids don't stay in the pathway, and certainly animals don't, and they go up against it and get to the people. So what I want to understand is how in poison ivy in those parks, you would deal with it. But with wild parsnip, which can have, I know the roots you can eat, but the top of it you can't, and it certainly can burn you. What is the program that's going to be done in the parks and publicly owned space that may not be called parks, like the hydro easement, but which are within the community and used by the community as parks?
Okay. Yeah, in parks, generally, if it's in an area that's already maintained or cut, we will, or be open to the people using the park, we will have it cut. Along trails and pathways, such as those through hydro easements, our standard service is to cut 3 swipes or two blade widths at either side of the pathway. To start clear cutting all of the hydro easements will be a fairly extensive and costly process, and we really don't have the funding or the service ability to do that at this point in time. It will be have to looked at as an enhancement, or a budget pressure would be the only way to take that on.
I'm not talking the whole hydro easement. When you have houses backing onto it, urban houses on both sides of a hydro easement, it effectively is a park. And I'm certainly going to be working with the one that goes through this community to turn it into a park. We're working on a community garden for part of it right now, for example, which will maintain it in different ways. But it's used by people widely, and the city staff are saying it should be a dog's permitted area, which means the dog will be running and will go through this parsnip, get it on their fur, and then they transfer it to the kids. And I'd like you to take it up with senior staff and maybe report back to us on how we can deal with. And there's 2 or 3 plants. This is one: the poison parsnip, the poison ivy, the giant hogweed. There's 3 or 4 that are causing a lot of problems. And report back how we're going to deal with them, because I'm sure this is a problem not only in my ward but in other wards in the city.
It's a provincial-wide problem with the wild parsnip. The Ministry of Natural Resources, Ministry of Agriculture are working with it as well. All our neighboring municipalities are working with it. Cutting is our best preference right now, or the best option we have. But if we have to increase cutting space that we have never cut before, then we'll have to come back with a plan to enhance that service.
But what I'm saying is, in the rural area, what you're doing on the ditches may be all you can do, but you're going to be looking into that for Councillor Moffat. I'm not talking I'm talking in the urban area. I'm talking in a developed urban area, not an undeveloped urban area. And I think we have to take a look, because there are so many more people being involved there that could be harmed by this. And if the city doesn't have a proper program on it, I think it could, in the future, it could destroy our parks as well. And, it's like the cost to replace grass in a park if it gets destroyed by these weeds. They're very, very invasive and very persistent.
In parks, we do cut a lot more frequently than rural roads. They're cut either bi-weekly or monthly if it's a passive area. So in parks, I think we should be very much on top of that invasive species. The hydro easements become a little tricky if it's still a hydro property. We have to look at each of those cases.
It's not a hydro property. It's owned by the city.
Okay, but hydro easements across the city, if we own the property, our practice, if it hasn't been clear cut, we do swipe along the pathways through that, and we do 2 swipes at the back people's property, so we don't have weeds going through. If we have to increase or turn it into a cultured space, then there is a cost to that, and we can look at each one individually and come up with a plan and come up with a cost.
So if I got it designated by the city as a park, which is some of the hydro easement is, we have a soccer field under it, and you cut those, then that would change the standard?
That would change the standard, but it would still require growth pressures to be able to take on the maintenance. So I'm just saying we can designate it, but it's still going to cost. If you increase the service and turn it into a park, there will be a cost to that, and we'll have to come up with a number to justify.
No, I understand that, but I think if we're going to have these properties that we own in the city...
Councillor, I think what staff is saying is if you want to pursue this matter, it's a budgetary item, and you would have to bring it forward at budget time if you want to add to the program.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Chair, I'm going further than that. I think that the city has to recognize that we own property throughout this city, and it's not just in my ward, and I'm sure this problem is found elsewhere. And if we own property and we have people living along it, hundreds and hundreds of people, then we have a responsibility to manage that property in a way that doesn't interfere with other people. And we're not doing that. And we've cut back too much on it. I think this is a citywide issue in the urban area, not a local issue. And I'd like staff to sort of start talking at the staff level before we start, trying to bring in bylaw changes and things like that, to see if they can come up with some ideas of how we should be dealing with the properties of this nature across the city, so that.
And I don't think Mr. O'Keefe in his responses is ignoring that fact. I think he's acknowledging not only is it a citywide problem, it's a provincial-wide problem. But I think what he's saying quite accurately is if we change the manner in which we're addressing it currently and go beyond parks to easements, there will be a cost pressure, and that he doesn't have the authority within his budget. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Mr. O'Keefe, but tell me if I've got this wrong, that you'll require direction from council at budget time to change the approach that you're currently using. Is that accurate?
You put better words in my mouth than I did. Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, they can also recommend to senior management that they need to have a better way of addressing these things. This is not an easement for the city. This is city-owned land. Right? Hydro has an easement over it. Hydro will look after the lands that they own. Hydro 1, this is a Hydro 1 one. But the city owns the land here, and we're using it in many places. Our new rec center, we're using it for parking. There's a school coming in, they're going to be using it. There's different things used it along the way. But it's not being in a specific use right now. What they're doing is creating a real mess in the middle of a community, and I'm sure you probably have some in your community too. So I'll follow up offline.
I was going to say, Mr. O'Keefe, can you follow up with the councillor offline to find out if in fact we own this piece of land, and if so, what we might be doing with it?
He doesn't have to find out. We know he owned it. I've been working with city staff on it for a long time. The problem that I have in the actual response on the words in the first place is that it only identified it as a problem in rural areas. That's all that's addressed here. And the wording of this answer is on the rural areas.
Okay, but I think
we need to look at the whole city.
And I think staff's made it clear that, as I said, it's not only a citywide problem, it's a province-wide problem, and they will speak to you offline. Councillor Chernyshenko, you wish to speak to the matter as well?
Yes, thank you. I didn't realize I would want to or feel the need to, but we're all getting into this one. If we are going to be looking at, rightly, at the cost of using pesticide treatment as opposed to a cutting one, I think it's equally important in that information to understand the effectiveness of it. Does it actually work? Is it as effective or more effective? And then what would be the environmental health implications? Are there issues for agriculture, for bee populations, for water, etc.? I just know of the example where reticently neighbors tried Roundup on poison ivy because nothing else was working, and it proved not to work as well. So we got both the impact of using a pesticide and no positive effect on the poison ivy. So I think that'll be very important if we're evaluating those two approaches.
That is correct, because pesticide may not solve the problem permanently. You either have to pull it out or continue to cut at least the wild parsnip. So it would have to be analyzed as a cost, plus the impacts of the people, and there would have to be open houses and posting, all that done if we get into a pesticide application.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. Councillor Hubley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, or as everybody else is calling you today, Mr. Mayor. My question is, do we have an idea of how much there is of this out there? Do we have any kind of an inventory, if you will, of how big a problem it is? Because as you said, Mr. O'Keefe, you're already taking care of it in the parks and walkways and everything. Do we know if there's other areas that we're not doing?
A lot of the vacant property, as Councillor Wilkinson has stated, that isn't maintained. Any vacant land, a lot of the areas on the rural roads that can't be reached by a mower, those are locations that wild parcels and in private property and in bush lots. It's pretty extensive across the entire city.
Okay. I wonder, Mr. Chair, if it would help if we ask staff to increase the communication effort on this and maybe put some additional information on the city's website and in our literature on what it looks like and what to do with it and so on. If that wouldn't help give us a better picture of how bad a situation it may be across the city.
I think Mr. O'Keefe's nodding his head and accepting that as direction. So I can say my experience has been quite positive in the sense that when it's arisen in my ward, Mr. O'Keefe's department has been quick to provide just the information that you're talking about to send to residents, and also to go and cut if necessary, if they've missed or it's grown back in. So Councillor Clark.
Thank you. You know, at the risk of recognizing wild parsnip only grows in the rural areas, I've had a complaint from another rural area, Rockcliffe Park, suitably rural. In any event, I believe invasive species are a problem of all kinds, whether it's buckthorn, poison ivy, the dog with that big thing. Anyway, we do not have a comprehensive strategy on invasive species. Maybe it's time to have somebody look at it. But I think that today we've received a report on what they do, and if that's not sufficient, then I think we need to pursue that envelope a little more. But at the suggestion that it's just rural, this particular response is just not true. I'm sure that wherever we have it, that we cut it out when we are actually cutting that property. And the question is whether we're cutting enough or whether we're going to find more money to cut more. Clearly that's a budget pressure freshly created, and we'll need to look at it. Personally, I think this is a plant that we do not wish to have growing in our backyards, and whether it's rural, urban, or high-rise condo. In any event, I think we should receive this item for information with the further information we've requested today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. You took the words right out of my mouth. And but Councillor Moffat is back on the list for hopefully the last word on wild parsnip for today.
Just want to be clear about, I hate to have something accidentally turn into a rural-urban issue. The inquiry spoke about control of wild parsnip across the city. I was never once saying that it was an isolated incident anywhere. I was actually in my preamble for when I did this a few months ago. I actually spoke about it being in Barhaven and whatnot in the suburban area. The response to it speaks about how you treat it in the rural area, which is through rural roadside cutting. But it also goes into how it can be found in other places, and you can't obviously, a rural roadside grass cutting approach doesn't work in an urban park. So clearly, Larry wouldn't have used that as an example for how to address the issue in a park. This is not a rural-urban issue, and I never alluded to the fact that it was. I don't think staff did. I think staff are trying to find an approach to treat it citywide, and if we can address it in more places than not, then we can improve the situation across the city. Thanks.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. Mr. O'Keefe, so if we agree to accept your report today, receive your report today, are you comfortable with the direction you've been given to look at some other issues arising from the report?
We will look at all those issues brought up.
Well, thank you very much. So report received, or information received? Thank you. That is all of the existing agenda items. Under information previously distributed, we have the 2014 Vehicle Growth Report, as noted in the agenda. And Do we have any notices of motion for consideration at a subsequent meeting? Councillor Clark?
On the vehicle growth, it struck me that there's some garbage trucks in there, and I wonder whether or not those garbage trucks were included in the low tender that we submitted to compete with the private sector. Was that purchase envisioned in the tender?
And Mr. O'Keefe's coming back to the mic to answer the question.
He doesn't know.
From my understanding, those garbage trucks have been moved out to 215, was the latest information I've had, and that would take them outside of the tender that they've currently put out, I believe. But I'll have to double check because that was the last word I had on it.
Well, then if we go back and adjust our equipment afterwards without it applying to that, I think we're probably not doing it right.
Agreed.
Thank you. Councillor Wilkinson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had a question. There are 9 vehicles requested for development inspectors that are SUVs. What's the particular reason that a development inspector needs an SUV?
We're going to ask Derek Moody to respond to that question. That's the client group that's using these vehicles.
Mr. Chair, the SUVs that we're talking about are not what sometimes people would envisage with the SUV title. We're not talking about four-wheel drives. What we are looking at are two-wheel drive, small SUVs. We went through a series of reviews with Fleet Services in 2012 to look at different types of vehicles to suit the needs. So what we have is a small SUV that really provides the ground clearance that we need for access to sites. It provides the adequate interior space to accommodate some of the equipment that we're installing in these vehicles as we go to a mobile office, and it also provides adequate and secure storage for equipment and tools.
Okay. Well, I was thinking of the big ones, so I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, notice of motion for consideration of the subsequent meeting. Any inquiries? Yes. Councillor Fleury? No? Councillor Clark?
He's got a waiver.
No, I realize he has a waiver, and that's another business. So,
all right. I have an inquiry.
Inquiry, thank you.
Many years ago, recognizing my long history around this table, we used to crack seal roadways with a liquid that covered a lot of the road and didn't allow water in to increase the amount of wear and tear on the roads. Somehow or other, that program has been deleted, and to my way of thinking, it's causing us to do a lot more patching than we might normally have to do. So while we repaired potholes in the first 8 months of this year, a total of some 153,000 of them, if we had been crack sealing all the way along, we probably wouldn't have that many potholes. So I'd like to know why this program was discontinued, what the value added would be to put it back in place, because it should net a reduction in the patching that we're doing. So maybe there's what the net cost would be before we get to consider a budget.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any other inquiries? Now, Councillor Fleury, I believe you have a motion for waiver you want us to consider?
I do. It's about it's in the Byron Market, and it's for the Oktoberfest. There was a recent grant approval from Toronto, from Ontario Tourism, for the Byron Market BIA, and they want to host a weekend event on Clarence Street between Dalhousie and Parent. So I'm asking for the waiver because of the proximity to the date and the requirement to go through a seat meeting.
On waiver? Carried. And on the motion? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
There is another motion which Councillor Tierney will be speaking to. I just want to say a few things briefly in advance. This is a motion that arises out of some good work done by a city resident, Mr. Rick Levesque, who is a resident, I believe, of Jan Harder's Barhaven ward, and also comes from a letter from MPP Lisa MacLeod, and the issue at hand is that of distracted driving and what we might be able to do to rein in essentially texting while driving. There are a number of issues coming up on this, a number of matters coming up on this, rather. And this is, well, I'll let Councillor Tierney, who has been working with me on this as well, explain the nature of the motion and the importance of why we need to go forward with it at this point in time. So, Councillor Tierney.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll just read the motion and then I'll discuss a couple of quick extra items in here. That the Transportation Committee waive the rules of procedure to consider the proposal pursuant to subsection 84(3) of the procedural bylaw in order to provide City Council the time required to consider the motion prior to a scheduled November 5th event in Toronto as outlined in the attached correspondence. Whereas the Ministry of Transportation for the Government of Ontario, of the Province of Ontario, has instituted a demerit point system for drivers, which encourages drivers to improve their behavior and protect people from drivers who are in abuse of the privilege of driving. And whereas effective October 26, 2009, the Ontario Highway Traffic Act was amended to include distracted driving as an offence, making it illegal for drivers to talk, text, type, dial, or email using handheld cell phones and other handheld communications and entertainment devices. And whereas, despite these changes, distracted driving was not included within the category of offences for which demerit points are recorded against the driver's record on conviction of this offence. And whereas the Ministry of Transportation notes where drivers take their eyes off the road for more than 2 seconds, their crash risk doubles, and the drivers using cell phones is 4 times more likely to be in a crash than a driver focused on the road. And according to the Ontario Provincial Police, distracted driving is cited as casual factor in 30 to 50% of the traffic collisions in Ontario. Whereas Ottawa resident Rick Levesque has mounted a public action campaign, Help Save Lives, Drive Hands Free, to encourage the provincial government to institute a demerit point penalty for distracted driving. Therefore, be resolved that the Transportation Committee recommends that City Council request, through the Mayor, that the provincial government make immediate changes to the Highway Traffic Act and regulations to include demerit points as one of the consequences flowing from a conviction of distracted driving, and that such be copied to our local MPPs. Further, be it resolved that this item rise to Council on the 9th of October 2013. And Mr. Chair, I just got to say, it's great to see, I don't think it's just a partisan issue. I think a lot of MPPs are now talking about it. And when I first got on the Council and Sergeant Gation actually came to me and said, you know, there's no real consequences for texting and driving. It's just financial. And we see it all the time. We've seen it in the news lately. Kids standing on street corners doing little mini stories on how many people are texting at stoplights. I think it's high time that we look at this and push for a demerit system to be put in place.
On waiver? On the motion itself? Councillor Flory?
Wonder if the councillor would be amendable to a friendly amendment, in my view, to send this request also on our behalf to the Minister of Transportation of Ontario.
Okay, thank you for that. It seems the amendment is accepted. Councillor Wilkinson.
Just a point, they said attached, there's a motion, something attached that we don't have. Could that be forwarded to us? He read it off that it's about the event, I believe, which is the reason for the...
It is in the shared drive, Councillor.
It's in the shared, it has been... Yeah, it's not on our agenda here. No, I think it should be circulated to all members of the council before the council meetings. We have it at the council.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was in the shared drive, that's the reason.
Okay.
Councillor Clark, you still on the list or no?
I don't think I'm going to resist.
You're good for the day? Thanks. So on the motion as amended by Councillor Fleury? Thank you. Adjournment? And the next meeting will be October the 9th at 2000... no, sorry. Yeah, sorry. The next meeting is October the 9th at 3 p.m. and it will be a joint meeting with the Transit Commission.